outgoing and men more withdrawn, and increases some pleasure-seeking activities. And the reason why it does this is because it releases a chemical called dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter. And it's also been linked to schizophrenia. So in light of those, it makes sense, because dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is involved with feeling pleasure, and schizophrenia is due to defects in the dopamine pathway, which also enters into a whole lot more interesting questions. If somebody is able to discern reality from, or if somebody is not able to discern reality from non-reality, can you still expect them to be saved? Are they still schizophrenic when they get into heaven? So it also brings up the concept of mind-body dualism. But just the concept that this being would allow a parasite that directly violates our own free will, that's kind of what makes that argument go down the drain for me, especially, it's also been linked to birth defects and spontaneous abortions. More fetuses are spontaneously aborted than, even the most dishonest abortion opponents could ever imagine. So, it also brings up the concept of fairness. I have to prove myself for hopefully around 80 more years, but that fetus, before it's ever born, basically gets a free ticket. So I don't think that really squares with ethics. Like I said at the beginning of the presentation, this one I'm gonna say is kind of a weak argument, because Francisco Ayala, basically his proposition is that evolution kind of nullifies the problem of evil. But when talking with people about evolution, the thing that I have, once you get past the whole proof thing, and once you explain to them the proof, the concepts, the one problem that they cite most frequently is that they can't believe that an all-knowing being or an all-loving being would have created through a process that causes, that basically went through millions of years of bloodshed to happen. And I cannot argue with this, because evolution is an incredibly brutal process, but also we have a lot of proof behind that. And a lot of the theistic evolutionist authors I read don't really address that concern. They focus more on the proof. So, but, if you study entomology for any amount of time, you start realizing that insects, the way that they have sex is sometimes incredibly crazy. Like, there are beetle penises, which look like these huge giant maces. Bedbugs have something called traumatic insemination, where the male actually stabs the female and ejaculates straight into her hemocoel. And, in laboratory settings, female bedbugs have been literally raped to death by males. So, nature is an incredibly brutal phenomenon. And there's also a genus of parasitoid wasps called Incarcia, which, to survive under very low host density, have evolved a system where the male actually develops it within as a parasitoid within a female of the same species, which eventually kills it. So, even though insects don't feel pain, pain is only one part of the definition of suffering, and I really don't see as incredible. When I use the term beautiful, I don't necessarily mean that it's good. Sometimes I talk about just the sheer brutality of it being beautiful in a poetic sense. But, something that would create something as awesomely evil as that, you have to wonder about its intentions regardless. And then there's always the concept of natural disasters. Even if we live in a world governed by natural processes, and the Creator wants to have it that way, you can't ignore the suffering that is caused from that. Like, for example, flooding. Even though the whole flood is a natural process, there are other elements to flooding which can really, really mess with things. Like, for example, if an area in Africa gets flooded, you have the problem with malaria mosquitoes breeding in those pools. And then one of the other things I thought I put this in here, but there are, if you want to say that the Earth is fine-tuned for life earlier, well, there are huge regions in Africa where basically no humans can live because of a disease called sleeping sickness. A fly bites you, trypanosome goes in, replicates in your brain, you go to sleep and die. And the only treatment for this is a chemical which, if, it's really too bad we didn't have 10 people in here, but basically 1 out of 10 times it's fatal. So if there were 10 people in this room, we all had, and all of us got treated for sleeping sickness, one of us would die just because of the treatment. And even that parasite shows signs of resistance to that treatment. And oh, they also have to inject it through a glass syringe because it'll melt plastic. So the way that I kind of cope with the problem of evil is it's really not a problem. The universe is really indifferent to us. We existed for millions upon millions of years before, or the Earth existed for millions upon millions of years before humans ever came on the scene. And even if all the mammals died off, not just humans, but mammals, died off in the world, things would still be relatively similar. Whereas if all the insects died off, every single ecosystem in the world would collapse. I think to suffer just is, a byproduct of existence. Simply put, shit happens. I also don't think religion can really ever be, and I'm going to be honest with you, I have a negative view of religion. I think it would be dishonest to hide this. But if you want to explain the reasons why the world is, you actually have to, or if you want to change why the world is, you have to explain the reasons why the world is. And these are not really explainable by religion. There are cultural factors behind the actions of people. There are biological factors between the actions of disease. Physical actions between between some of the natural disasters. And understanding these as such is what's key to preventing them. And sometimes things happen for no reason at all. They just happen. So, like I said, this is mostly geared towards the deity, the version of the deity that I was brought up in, but not all versions of deities are all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful. Greco-Roman gods, for instance, very good example. But, if a lot of these arguments you can argue for essentially any deity, even one that we know is fake. And in a lot of the labs I work in, we have something called a negative control, which is where we run the experiment in a way that we know is not going to happen. For instance, if you run a experiment to replicate DNA, what you do is you run another experiment to replicate just the same way you did to replicate the DNA, only you don't add the DNA you want to replicate, just to make sure it's not contaminated. And if everything goes right, nothing happens, and and if nothing happens in the other ones, we can just assume that it didn't work, and I kind of take the same line. I don't think, I think that version of a deity is very difficult, maybe not impossible to disprove, but if